Hube's pocket. March, April 1944. We were checking ammunition counts along the second trench line when the sky tore open. I had been walking the position since before dawn with Feldwebel Riedel, tallying what remained after 3 months of continuous fighting. The division had bled itself white at Korsun-Cherkasy in February, pulling what was left of 2 trapped corps out of the snow, and we had received almost nothing since. Riedel carried a clipboard with figures that told a story nobody wanted to read. 14 rounds per MG position on average, 6 mines for 200 meters of front, mortar ammunition enough for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained fire. He had mentioned this to me twice already that morning. I told him to keep counting. The barrage began at 0640, not the usual harassing fire we had grown accustomed to, the scattered salvos that came and went like bad weather. This was something else entirely. The ground moved beneath our boots before the sound reached us. Riedel dropped flat without a word, and I followed, pressing into the frozen mud at the bottom of the trench, and for the next several minutes the world became nothing but noise and pressure and dirt raining from above. The timber reinforcements along the trench wall cracked and split. Somewhere behind us, an ammunition store caught fire and began cooking off in sharp, irregular bursts that punctuated the deeper roar of the Soviet guns. I had been through bombardments before. Kursk, the winter fighting at Zhytomyr, the meat grinder at Korsun. But this was heavier than anything I had experienced on this front. The shells were landing in patterns, systematic, methodical, walking across our positions from east to west. This was preparation fire, textbook preparation fire. And it meant that whatever was coming behind it was coming with everything they had. When it lifted, not stopped, but shifted rearward to our supply routes and command posts, Riedel was already up and running. I followed. The trench was half collapsed in 3 places. We passed 2 men from the 3rd platoon who were digging out a 3rd, his legs buried under a beam and packed earth. He was conscious, but making sounds I could not classify as words. I told them to get him to the aid station and kept moving. The first T-34s came through the fog 12 minutes later. Obergefreiter Brenner saw them first. He was manning one of our forward observation points, a dugout reinforced with logs that overlooked a shallow valley to the northeast. He reported movement at roughly 800 meters, dark shapes emerging from the mist and the smoke of the barrage. I reached his position and raised my field glasses. The fog was patchy, thinning in places, thick in others, and through the gaps I counted 4, then 7, then more than I could track. They were moving in a broad line, not fast. The ground was soft. The spring thaw had begun weeks ago, and every meter of Ukraine was turning into a swamp. But they were moving steadily, and behind them I could make out the dark clusters of infantry. I sent Brenner to the company command post with a report. He came back within minutes with nothing useful. The telephone lines to battalion were cut, the radio was intermittent, and Hauptmann Griesinger had no orders except to hold. Hold with what? Nobody said. The park crew on our left flank opened fire at 600 meters. Their first round hit the lead tank somewhere on the turret, a flash of sparks, nothing more. The T-34 traversed its gun toward them. The second round from the pack struck lower near the hull, and this time the tank lurched to a stop. Smoke poured from the engine deck, but the others kept coming, 4, 5, 6 of them now visible in our sector alone. The sound of tank engines through fog is something that stays, a low grinding drone that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the earth under your feet before your ears properly locate it. The men around me knew what it meant. I watched a loader on the pack crew feed rounds into the breach, with hands that were shaking so badly the first shell slipped and he had to retrieve it from the mud. We knocked out 2 more before they reached our wire. The third T-34 in line took a round through the track and slewed sideways, blocking the path for the one behind it. But on our right, where the terrain dipped into a shallow draw, 3 tanks had already passed through unengaged. They rolled over the first trench line, literally over it, the tracks grinding down the parapet and collapsing the walls onto whoever had not pulled back in time. I heard the MG positions there go silent, one by one. Riedel appeared beside me. He reported that the right flank was gone, 2 platoons overrun in the first 20 minutes. The Soviets were already behind us in the draw. He said this the way he said everything, flat, factual, as if reading from the clipboard he no longer carried. I gave the order to pull back to the second line. We moved in pairs, leapfrogging between shell craters and collapsed positions while the surviving PaK covered what it could. Lieutenant Eltmann was somewhere to our left with what remained of his platoon. I could hear his MG-42 firing in long, sustained bursts, which meant either he was keeping heads down or he was burning through his last belts without caring. When we linked up 20 minutes later, near the road junction behind the second trench, he told me his platoon was down to 11 men. He had started the morning with 32. The counterattack order came at midday. Battalion had somehow re-established contact, and the instruction was to retake the forward positions. Riedel looked at me when I read it aloud. He said nothing. His face said everything, that the forward positions no longer existed, that we had perhaps 40 men between us, that the Soviets had tanks in numbers we could not match and artillery that had not stopped firing since dawn. We attacked anyway. Through the draw on the right, using the wrecked T-34 as cover for the approach. Eltmann took the left with his 11 men. I went with Riedel and the remnants of 2nd and 3rd platoons through the center. We made it roughly 200 meters before the machine guns found us. Soviet infantry had already dug in along what had been our forward trench. They had turned our own positions against us, our own fields of fire, our own carefully planned kill zones. I lost 3 men in the first 30 seconds. We went to ground in a crater that still smelled of the shell that had made it hours earlier, and from there I could see that the counterattack had already failed. Eltmann's group had been pinned down behind a shattered farmhouse. Nobody was moving forward. I pulled back. No order from above. The radio was dead again. I pulled back because continuing was not combat. It was suicide, and dead men do not defend second lines. By nightfall, the situation was no longer local. Reports filtered in through runners and fragments of radio contact that painted a picture far worse than our sector. The Soviet offensive extended across the entire front of the First Ukrainian Front, hundreds of kilometers wide. The 3rd Guards Tank Army and the 4th Tank Army had broken through north of our positions. The Lvov-Odessa railway had been cut. Divisions we had fought beside for months were reported destroyed or out of contact. Riedel found me after dark in the cellar of a farmhouse that served as our temporary command post. He had scrounged ammunition from 2 dead men's pouches and a damaged supply vehicle that had been hit on the road. He reported our strength: 29 combat-effective soldiers, 1 functioning MG-42, no anti-tank weapons remaining. He asked what the orders were. I told him the orders were to hold. He nodded. Neither of us believed we would be holding anything for long. The shelling resumed at 2200. It would not stop again for weeks. Over the following days, we retreated, not in the orderly manner that manuals describe, not in phased withdrawals with covering forces and prepared positions. We retreated the way water retreats from a broken dam, in surges, in chaos, pressed by a force that seemed limitless and that gave us no moment to breathe. By the 10th of March, I no longer knew where we were on the map. The map itself had become meaningless. The lines drawn on it bore no relation to reality. Soviet armor had penetrated to depths of 60, 80, 100 kilometers behind what had been the front. We were moving southwest, that much I knew from the compass, and we were doing it because every other direction was blocked or burning. Brenner drove the Kubelwagen when there was fuel. When there was no fuel, which was most of the time, we walked. The roads were rivers of mud. Vehicles that stopped sank to their axles within minutes. We passed abandoned trucks, staff cars, even a Panther that sat immobile in the middle of a crossroads, its crew sitting on the hull smoking cigarettes with the resigned air of men who had accepted that their war was now on foot. The mud of the Rasputitsa consumed everything. It pulled at our boots, it swallowed equipment, it turned every kilometre into an ordeal measured in hours. And behind us, always behind us, the sound of engines and guns that never stopped. The road south of Yampol was where I first understood we were trapped. We had been retreating for 17 days, 17 days of rearguard actions and shattered positions, of sleeping in ditches and eating whatever could be found in abandoned supply dumps or the packs of dead men. The division, what was left of it, had been pushed southwest toward the Dniester in a series of fighting withdrawals that blurred together into one continuous nightmare of mud and Soviet armor. By the 21st of March, the front had ceased to exist as a coherent line. It existed only as pockets of resistance, clusters of exhausted men moving through a landscape that the enemy already owned. We were on the road with a mixed column. Elements of our regiment, a signals detachment that had lost its equipment, a dozen walking wounded from some infantry unit whose designation nobody could remember. Brenner was driving a horse cart now, the Kubelwagen abandoned 3 days earlier when the last drop of fuel went into a Panzer IV that was still fighting. Riedel walked beside me at the head of our little group, his rifle slung, his eyes scanning the tree line on both sides of the road with the mechanical vigilance of a man who'd been doing this so long it had become involuntary. The Ilyushin twos came from the east at treetop level. There was no warning. One moment the road was quiet, except for the sucking of boots in mud and the creak of cartwheels. The next, the sound, that particular howl of radial engines at full power, close, too close. And then the road erupted. The first pass killed 8 men and 4 horses in the space of 3 seconds. The Sturmoviks came in pairs, their wing-mounted cannons tearing the column apart. I threw myself into the ditch on the left side of the road and pressed my face into the mud. The ground shook. A horse screamed, a sound worse than any human voice. Something wet hit the back of my coat, and I did not look to see what it was. Riedel was in the ditch beside me. He had his hands over his helmet, a gesture that was useless against 23mm cannon shells, but that every soldier made anyway. The aircraft passed over us and banked to the left, coming around for another run. I raised my head enough to see the road. A cart was burning. Bodies and pieces of bodies lay in the mud. A horse was down, kicking, tangled in its traces. Brenner was nowhere visible. The second pass was worse because we could see it coming. The 2 aircraft lined up on the road from the south, nose on, and came in low. I watched the flashes from their wings and pressed deeper into the ditch as the rounds chewed along the road surface, throwing up geysers of mud and gravel. A man I did not know was lying in the ditch 5 meters from me. When the aircraft passed, he was no longer lying. He was spread across the bank behind him. They made 4 passes total. When they left, climbing away to the east with an almost casual waggle of wings, the road was a slaughterhouse. Brenner appeared from behind an overturned cart, his face grey, one arm hanging oddly. He reported that the cart was destroyed and 2 of our 3 remaining horses were dead. The third was standing in a field nearby, trembling, its eyes white. I counted my people. We had lost 6 in the attack. 11 from the signals detachment were dead or dying. The walking wounded had scattered into the fields, and some did not come back. We kept moving. That evening, the rumors became fact. A motorcycle dispatch rider from Division caught up with our column at a crossroads where 4 different units had converged into a knot of vehicles and men that took 2 hours to untangle. He told us what we already suspected. The 1st and 4th Soviet tank armies had linked up with the 40th Army south of us. Khotin had fallen. The last corridor out was gone. The 1st Panzer Army, all 200,000 men of it, was encircled. Riedel heard this and asked the dispatch rider to repeat the number, 200,000. The rider confirmed it. Riedel asked how much fuel the division had. The rider did not know. Riedel asked about ammunition resupply. The rider did not know that either. He drove off into the gathering dark, and we did not see him again. That night we dug in on a ridge overlooking a river crossing that no longer served any purpose since there was nowhere to cross to. Eltmann found me in a shallow foxhole that I shared with Riedel. He brought a canteen of something that was not coffee, but was hot, and we sat in the dark and listened to the artillery. Ours and theirs, though ours was growing thinner each hour as batteries ran dry. Eltmann said someone at the regimental command post had used the word Stalingrad. He said it quietly, the way one mentions a disease. Riedel made a sound in his throat that might have been a laugh. He said Stalingrad had airfields. Stalingrad had supply corridors that lasted weeks. Stalingrad had time. We had none of those things. I told them both to shut up about Stalingrad. It was not a useful comparison, and it would destroy whatever morale remained if the men heard it. Eltmann nodded, but his eyes said he was already making the comparison and could not stop. The Soviets tested our perimeter that night, a probing attack against the southern edge of the pocket, where our infantry divisions held a thin line along the Dniester. We heard the fighting, the distinctive ripping sound of their PPSH submachine guns, the heavier hammer of our MGs, the crump of mortar rounds. It went on for 2 hours. At one point a flare went up and illuminated the landscape to the south in harsh white light, the river, the fields, the tree line full of moving shadows. Then it died, and the darkness returned, and the fighting continued in the blind. Closer to us, a reconnaissance patrol from a Soviet rifle division stumbled into our outpost line around midnight. There were perhaps 20 of them. They came through a gully that we had not wired because we had no wire left. Brenner, his arm now bound in a sling improvised from a belt, spotted them first and opened fire with his carbine. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. We killed 9. The rest withdrew into the gully and did not return. One of our men took a round through the hand, the bullet entering the palm and exiting between the knuckles. He looked at it with a kind of academic curiosity, as if it belonged to someone else. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my foxhole and stared at the darkness to the east, where the horizon glowed with a faint orange pulse. The fires of the Soviet advance, the burning supply dumps, the villages that were being fought over or simply consumed. The pocket was roughly 40 kilometers across at its widest point. 200,000 men in 40 kilometers of mud with almost no fuel, dwindling ammunition, and 6 Soviet armies pressing from every direction. Riedel sat beside me, cleaning his rifle by touch in the dark. He said nothing for a long time. Then he mentioned that he had heard the Soviets had sent an ultimatum, surrender, or every man in the pocket would be shot. He said he did not know if this was true. He said it did not matter. Nobody was going to surrender, not because of courage or ideology or any grand principle, because the men in this pocket had been fighting Russians for 3 years and they knew what surrender meant. I asked him if he had any tobacco left. He produced a single cigarette from somewhere inside his coat and broke it in half. We smoked in silence, cupping the glowing tips in our palms so the light would not show. The tobacco was stale and harsh. It was the best cigarette I ever had. Somewhere to the west, far to the west, beyond the Soviet lines that now surrounded us on every side, there were German forces. We did not know this yet. We knew only that we were encircled, that we were running out of everything. and that the morning would bring more of what every morning had brought for 17 days. Except that the next morning brought something none of us expected. It brought an order. The order arrived at dawn on the 26th through a Fieseler Storch that landed in a field so soft the wheels sank to the axles before the propeller stopped turning. A Hauptmann from army staff climbed out, carrying a leather dispatch case, and asked for the nearest regimental command post. Brenner pointed him down the road with his good arm. The pilot stayed with the aircraft, smoking, watching the eastern horizon where the flashes had not stopped since the night before. Within hours, the shape of what was coming filtered down through the chain of command in fragments. Riedel heard it first from a Feldwebel in the supply company who had been present when the regimental commander briefed his battalion leaders. The essential facts were these. We were breaking out. Not south, where the distance to friendly lines was shortest. West, through the Soviet forces that had created the breach in the first place. Across the Zbruch, then the Serret, then the Strypa, 150 kilometers of enemy-held territory to link up with a relief force that was supposedly coming from the direction of Tarnopol. Riedel relayed this to me with the same flat tone he used for ammunition counts. I asked him to repeat the direction, west. I asked if he was certain. He was certain. I looked at the map, my map, stained and torn, held together at the fold with medical tape, and traced the route with my finger. Every meter of it was behind Soviet lines. Every river crossing would be contested, and we had almost no fuel. Eltmann found me studying the map. He had heard the same information through a different channel and wanted confirmation. I confirmed it. He stood there for a moment, looking at the ground, and then said something about Manstein, that it was Manstein's plan, that Hube had wanted to go south and Manstein had overruled him, that the whole thing depended on surprise. The Soviets expected us to go south toward Romania because the terrain was easier. Going west was insane, which was exactly why it might work. The reorganization began immediately. The army was consolidated into Korpsgruppen, Corps Group Chevalerie for the northern column, Corps Group Breith for the southern. We were assigned to Chevalerie. The 1st Panzer Division would lead the vanguard. Our regiment, or what remained of it, would be among the first units to move. And then came Hube's order about the vehicles. I read it to the company that afternoon, standing in the yard of a shattered collective farm while the men sat on rubble and listened. Every vehicle that was not vital to the breakout was to be destroyed immediately. Ruthlessly, the order said. Every unnecessary truck, every staff car, every workshop trailer, every field kitchen. The fuel from those vehicles was to be drained and given to the tanks and combat vehicles that would spearhead the attack. Everything else was ballast. Everything else would hinder success. Everything else was to burn. The silence that followed was worse than any bombardment. These were men who had maintained their vehicles through 3 years of war on the Eastern Front, who had nursed engines through Russian winters and Ukrainian summers, who had welded cracked chassis plates at 2 in the morning by the light of shielded torches, who had bartered and scrounged and stolen spare parts from every source imaginable to keep their machines running. And now they were being told to destroy them. Riedel organized the destruction with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything. He walked through the vehicle park, such as it was, a muddy field where 14 trucks, 3 Kubelwagen, 2 half-tracks, and a signals van sat in various states of disrepair, and marked each one. Those with fuel went first. The crews drained what they could into jerry cans, then pulled the vehicles off the road into the field. Some men removed personal items from the cabs, photographs, letters, a wooden figure that someone had carved during a quiet moment that now seemed to belong to a different life. The explosions began at dusk. Brenner used grenades on the first 2 trucks. The fuel in the engine blocks caught, and the flames climbed fast, sending columns of black smoke into the grey sky. Along the road in both directions, other units were doing the same. The horizon flickered with fires that were not Soviet, they were ours. Our own equipment, our own capability, burning because there was no fuel to move it and no choice but to deny it to the enemy. I watched a Panzer IV burn. It sat in a depression 50 meters from the road, its turret traversed to one side, immobile for days after its last drop of diesel had been siphoned for a command half-track. The crew had already removed the breech block and the optics. An engineer placed charges under the hull, and the detonation cracked the night open. The tank burned with a fierce white heat, the ammunition inside cooking off in a chain of muffled thumps that went on for 15 minutes. The crew stood watching. One of them, a young Gefreiter whose name I never learned, was crying without sound, his face lit by the flames. Around us, the pocket shrank. Hube had ordered the perimeter compressed to shorten the defensive lines, pulling units inward, tightening the formation for the march. The effect was claustrophobic. 200,000 men packed into a space that grew smaller by the hour. Roads became impassable not from mud alone, but from the sheer density of men and horses and vehicles competing for every meter. At one intersection, I counted elements of 7 different divisions passing through in the space of an hour. Their remnants mixed together like cards from separate decks shuffled into one. The horses were taking over. With the motor vehicles burning, the Panzer wagons became the backbone of the army's logistics. Small, sturdy, horse-drawn carts that the Wehrmacht had requisitioned from Ukrainian peasants years ago. They were loaded now with ammunition boxes, radio equipment, medical supplies, and the wounded who could not walk. The horses stood in the mud with their heads down, patient, unaware that they were now the most valuable assets in an army that had once rolled across Europe on diesel engines. Riedel redistributed what we had. Each man carried his weapon, as much ammunition as he could manage, one day's ration, and nothing else. Personal kit was abandoned. Packs were stripped to essentials. I watched men drop items into the mud that they had carried for years, books, extra clothing, mess kits that had accompanied them from training depots in Germany to the steppes of Russia. One man from the signals detachment carefully placed a violin case against a stone wall, looked at it for a moment, and walked away. That night, the Soviets attacked the eastern perimeter. A full-scale assault by elements of what we later identified as the 3rd Guards Tank Army. The fighting was savage and close. The pocket was so compressed that the front line was barely 2 kilometers from the road junctions where the columns were forming for the breakout. I could hear the tank engines and the crash of anti-tank rounds while we organized our march order. Flares went up over the eastern edge, and in their light I could see tracer arcing across the sky in streams of red and green, the colors almost festive against the dark. The infantry divisions on the perimeter held. They held because there was nothing behind them. If they broke, the entire army died. Men fought from foxholes that were half filled with water, firing until their barrels glowed, falling back 10 meters and fighting again. The sounds carried across the pocket all night. The grinding of armor, the staccato of automatic weapons, the screams that rose and fell and rose again. By midnight, the eastern perimeter had bent but not broken. The columns were forming. The route west was mapped, the objectives assigned. Zbruch River first, then Serret, then Strypa. 150 kilometers, no fuel to speak of. Soviet armies on every side. I gathered my people in the dark. 26 men, 2 functioning MGs, a single Panzerfaust, rifles, grenades, whatever we could carry. Riedel on my right, Eltmann behind with his reduced platoon, Brenner with his arm in a sling and a carbine in his good hand. I told them we were moving at 0400, west, through the enemy, to friendly lines that we could not see, could not contact, and could not be certain existed. Nobody asked questions. There were no questions left to ask. We stepped off at 0400 into a darkness that was absolute. The column moved west along a farm track that existed on no map I had ever seen. A guide from the Divisional Reconnaissance Battalion led the vanguard, a lieutenant whose name was Faulkner or Faulkner, I never saw it written, and he navigated by compass and by the feel of the ground under his boots. Behind him came our advance party, then the main body of the regimental Kampfgruppe, then the tail with the wounded on Panzer wagons and whatever heavy weapons we still possessed. Behind all of us, the eastern sky pulsed with the orange glow of the perimeter battles that the infantry was fighting to buy us time. The first hour was silent, except for the sound of boots and hooves in mud. Nobody spoke. Orders were passed by touch. A hand on a shoulder, a tap, a gesture invisible to anyone more than a meter away. The mud was knee-deep in places, and the column slowed to a crawl, men pulling each other through the worst stretches, horses straining against traces that cut into their flesh. A wagon became stuck, and 4 men worked to free it, while the column flowed around them in the dark. I heard a wheel crack and a muffled curse, and then the sound of crates being transferred to another wagon by feel alone. We made contact at 0530. The guide had brought us to the edge of a village, I never learned its name, where Soviet infantry had established a blocking position. We heard them before we saw them. Voices, the clink of equipment, the sound of an engine idling somewhere behind the first buildings. Faulkner halted the column with a raised fist and came back to me. He reported an estimated platoon strength, possibly more. They were dug in along the road that ran through the village center, the road we needed. There was no time for reconnaissance, no time for flanking maneuvers or fire plans drawn on paper. The column behind us stretched back kilometers. If we stopped, everything stopped. 200,000 men stacked up behind us on a single track in the dark. I brought Eltman forward with his MG team. Riedel took a squad right, through an orchard that bordered the village on the northern side. I took the rest straight up the road. We opened fire at 50 meters. The MG ripped through the darkness, and the muzzle flash lit the scene in strobing fragments. A wall, a fence post, figures moving. The Soviet position erupted in return fire. Tracer laced across the road at waist height, and I went down, rolled behind a stone trough that served as a watering station for livestock, and fired my pistol at shapes I could barely distinguish from the darkness around them. Someone was screaming, ours or theirs, impossible to tell. Riedel hit them from the flank. His squad came through the orchard and into the rear of the Soviet position, firing as they moved. The effect was immediate. The defensive fire slackened, then shifted toward this new threat, and in that moment I was up and running with 6 men behind me, crossing the last 30 meters to the nearest building. We went through the doorway without stopping. A Soviet soldier was inside, turning toward us, his weapon coming up. Someone, I think it was Brenner, fired twice from the hip, and the man fell against the wall and slid down it. The fight for the village lasted 20 minutes. We cleared it building by building, room by room, in a brutal close-quarters engagement that was fought with rifles, grenades, bayonets, and in at least one case, bare hands. I found Riedel afterwards sitting against a wall, reloading his rifle with fingers that were black with powder residue. He reported 3 killed on our side, 5 wounded. The Soviets had lost more. I counted 11 bodies in the road and the buildings, though there were probably others in the dark. The column resumed moving before the bodies were cold. This became the pattern of the breakout. Move, fight, move again, fight. The Soviet blocking positions were scattered and often under strength. Their commanders had not expected the breakout to come west, and their forces were thin in this sector. But each one cost time and men that we could not afford to lose. By dawn on the 29th, we had fought through 3 more engagements, and the ammunition Riedel had so carefully distributed was already running low. The Zbruch River appeared on the morning of the 30th. We saw it from a low ridge, 2 kilometers east of Gorodok. a dark line cutting across the grey-brown landscape, swollen with snowmelt, its banks soft and treacherous. The bridges were the objective. Division had identified 3 crossing points, and the 1st Panzer Division was to seize them before the Soviets could react. What we found at Gorodok was not an undefended crossing. A Soviet anti-tank battery had positioned itself on the western bank, covering the bridge approach with 3 76mm guns. Behind them, infantry had dug in along the river bank. The bridge itself was intact, a timber structure wide enough for vehicles, but the approach road ran straight for 200 meters with no cover on either side. A killing ground, the assault went in at 1000. 2 companies abreast, with our surviving half-track providing what suppressive fire its mounted MG could offer. I led the left company. 21 men, designation meaningless at this point. They were fragments of platoons and squads, reassembled into something that functioned through habit and desperation. The first 100 meters were covered at a run. The mud grabbed at our boots, but fear moved us faster than the ground could hold us. At 150 meters, the Soviet guns opened up. Not the anti-tank battery, they were holding fire for vehicles, but the infantry positions. Machine gun fire swept the approach road, and men began to fall. The soldier beside me, a Gefreiter from the pioneer platoon, whose name I had learned only that morning, took a round through the throat and dropped without a sound. I kept running. Everyone kept running. Stopping on that road meant dying on that road. We reached the bridge approaches in a ragged line and went to ground behind whatever cover existed. A low stone wall, a drainage ditch, the wreck of a Soviet truck that had been there for days. From here, I could see the gun positions on the far bank. The crews were traversing their weapons toward us. If they fired canister or high explosive into our clustered positions at this range, the assault was finished. Riedel saved the bridge. He had taken 4 men and the Panzerfaust, our single Panzerfaust, our only anti-armor weapon, and worked his way down the riverbank to a position 40 meters upstream. From there, he had a flank shot on the nearest gun emplacement. He fired at 30 meters. The warhead struck the gun shield, and the detonation killed the crew and set off the ready ammunition stacked beside the weapon. The explosion was enormous, a pillar of flame and smoke and debris that momentarily silenced every other weapon on the field. In that silence, I was on my feet, shouting something that was not a word but a sound, and 20 men were up with me, and we were on the bridge. The timber planks were slick with moisture, and one man slipped and fell through a gap where boards were missing, and I heard him hit the water below, but I did not stop. Nobody stopped. We crossed in seconds that felt like hours and hit the western bank, firing into the smoke and confusion of the destroyed gun position. The other 2 guns opened fire. One round passed so close to my head that I felt the pressure change in my left ear, a sensation like being slapped by an invisible hand. The crew of the nearest gun was trying to depress the barrel to hit us at close range, but we were already inside their minimum engagement distance. Eltman reached the gun pit first, threw a grenade, and the fight became hand-to-hand among the earthworks. By 10:45, the western bank was ours. The bridge was intact. Behind us, the first vehicles of the column were already crossing. Panzer wagons, walking wounded, the remnants of a signals company carrying their equipment on their backs. The anti-tank crews lay dead around their guns. I sat on the edge of a gun pit and looked at the river and felt nothing except a hollowness that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of something worse. We had lost 9 men taking the bridge. 9 men to cross 30 meters of timber over brown water. Riedel appeared with the empty Panzerfaust tube, which he discarded into the river with a gesture that was almost casual. He reported that Brenner had been hit. A fragment from the gun explosion had caught him in the thigh, his second wound in a week. He was being loaded onto a wagon. The column continued to flow across the bridge for the next 6 hours. Unit after unit, thousands of men, horses, wagons, the wounded, the stragglers, all funneling through this single point. The Soviets began shelling the crossing at noon, sporadic at first, then heavier as they brought up more batteries. Rounds landed in the river, on the banks, on the road. A direct hit on the bridge would end everything. But the bridge held. Whether through luck or poor Soviet aim or divine indifference, the bridge held. That night we pushed on. West, always west. Behind us, the rear guard fought to keep the Soviets from collapsing the route we had opened. We heard the fighting all through the night, the sound diminishing with distance, but never disappearing entirely, a constant reminder that the men behind us were paying for every kilometre we gained. On the 31st of March, we reached the Serret River. Here, the destruction reached its peak. The order came down to blow up everything that could not cross. Along the eastern bank, in the hours before midnight, hundreds of vehicles were driven to the water's edge and detonated. The night was lit by a chain of explosions that ran along the river for kilometres. Trucks, half-tracks, staff cars, ambulances, all burning. The smoke was thick enough to taste. The sound was continuous, a rolling thunder of destruction that was entirely of our own making. We crossed the Smotrich on a makeshift bridge of logs and planks that engineers had thrown together in 4 hours. The water came up to the chest of the men who waded alongside the wagons to steady them. It was cold enough that my legs went numb within minutes. A horse lost its footing on the river bottom and went down, dragging a wagon sideways. 3 men fought to cut the traces while the current pulled at them. The horse surfaced downstream, swimming, and made the far bank on its own. The wagon and its contents, 2 crates of mortar ammunition and a wounded unteroffizier, were lost to the river. On the western bank, I gathered what I had. 17 men, no anti-tank weapons. 2 MGs with perhaps 300 rounds between them. Eltmann was still with me. Riedel was still with me. Brenner was on a wagon somewhere behind us, alive but out of the fight. The Strypa was next, and beyond the Strypa, if the plan held, if the relief force existed, if everything that had been promised was not simply the desperate invention of a command structure grasping at hope, beyond the Strypa was salvation. We kept walking. The Soviets found us on the 1st of April. Not the scattered blocking positions we had been fighting through. Those were rear area troops, garrison units, logistics detachments caught off guard by an army moving through territory they thought was secure. What found us on the 1st of April was armor. A column of T-34s from the 4th Tank Army that had been redeployed north after recapturing Kamenets-Podolsky, now racing to cut off the route west before we could reach the Serret. We heard them before we saw them. That grinding drone again, transmitted through the earth, felt in the knees and the stomach before the ears registered it. I was walking near the head of the column on a road that was more suggestion than surface, 2 ruts of churned mud between fields of half-melted snow, when Riedel grabbed my arm and pointed north. Through the haze, perhaps a kilometre away, dark shapes moving parallel to our route. 5, 8, 12 of them. The column stopped. 200,000 men compressed into a corridor barely 5 kilometers wide, and the column stopped because there was armor on the flank and nothing to fight it with. Our last Panzerfaust was at the bottom of the Zbruch. The MGs were useless against T-34s. We had rifles and grenades and boots full of mud. The tanks did not turn toward us. They continued west, parallel, moving faster than we could march, heading for the Serret crossing points. They were trying to get there first. And if they did, the door would close and we would die in the mud between the Zbruch and the Serret, with no way forward and 6 Soviet armies pressing from behind. The order came to force march. No rest, no stops. Move or die. We moved. Men who had not slept in 3 days moved. Men with open wounds moved. Men who were carrying other men moved. the column stretched and compressed like a living thing, surging forward on the better ground, bunching up where the mud turned to soup. Horses collapsed and were cut from their traces and left where they fell. Wagons that broke down were pushed off the track and abandoned. The wounded who could not keep pace were loaded onto any cart that still rolled. Those carts were already full. The Serret crossing was a bridge that should not have existed. A wooden structure that local peasants had built for farm traffic, never intended for military use, barely wide enough for a single wagon. Engineers from the division had reinforced it with timber cut from a nearby woodlot, working through the night of the 1st, while Soviet artillery searched for the crossing point with sporadic fire that fell mostly in the fields on either side. We crossed on the morning of the 2nd under a sky that had turned to iron. Snow was falling, late, heavy, wet snow that clung to everything and reduced visibility to 200 meters. The bridge groaned under every load. A wagon carrying mortar ammunition went through a weak section and dropped half a meter before the replacement beams caught it. The driver whipped the horses forward and the wagon lurched across the gap, boards cracking and splaying under the wheels. Behind it, engineers hammered new planks into place while the next wagon was already rolling forward. On the western bank, the landscape opened into rolling farmland, cut by shallow ravines. The snow was our ally now. It grounded the Soviet Air Force that had been tearing at the column for days. But it also slowed us further, adding weight to every step, soaking through uniforms that had not been dry since March began. The ambush at the village came on the afternoon of the 3rd. We had moved into a settlement, perhaps 40 houses arranged along a single road, to find it apparently abandoned. Eltmann took a squad through the first buildings and reported them clear. The column began threading through the village center. Then, every window on the southern side of the road opened fire simultaneously. Soviet infantry, a full company, dug into cellars and upper floors, positioned with overlapping fields of fire that turned the village road into a corridor of death. The first volley killed 5 men and dropped a horse that fell sideways across the road, blocking the wagons behind it. There was no cover on the road. I threw myself against the nearest building wall and pressed flat while rounds cracked past at head height. Rydell was across the road, pinned behind a stone well, returning fire at a window on the 2nd floor of a house 20 meters away. I could see his muzzle flash with each shot. Somewhere behind me, one of our MGs opened up, hammering rounds into the buildings, the tracers punching through wooden walls and sending splinters flying. We fought through the village house by house. The same brutal method as every engagement since the breakout began. Grenades through windows, kick the door, clear the room, move to the next. Eltmann led the assault on the largest building, a 2-story structure that anchored the Soviet defense. He went through the ground floor with 3 men. I heard the grenades, the burst of automatic fire, then silence. When he came out the back door, his uniform was torn, and there was blood on his face that he said was not his. The village cost us 2 hours and 14 men. 14 men who had survived the encirclement, the destruction, the river crossings, the forced marches, only to die in an unnamed village on an unnamed road because a Soviet company commander had chosen to make his stand there. We left them where they fell. There was no time to bury anyone. There had not been time to bury anyone for days. That night the rearguard died. Not all of it. Some elements would fight their way through over the following days, but the main rearguard force, infantry divisions that had held the eastern face of the pocket while the rest of the army moved west, was finally overwhelmed. We heard it. The sound of sustained combat to the east that rose to a crescendo around midnight and then faded, not into silence, but into the scattered popping of small arms that meant organized resistance had ended, and what remained was men fighting in isolation. I did not know the units involved. I did not know the names of the men who held those positions so that my column could keep moving. I knew only that they had been ordered to hold, and that they had held until holding was no longer possible, and that most of them would not be walking west. Riedel knew. He sat cleaning his rifle in the dark, always cleaning his rifle, the one constant in a world that had lost all others, and he said that the rear guard had been built from the infantry divisions, the ones without vehicles, without armor, without mobility. The ones who could only stand and fight because they could not move fast enough to do anything else. He said this without bitterness. He said it as a fact, the way he said everything. By the morning of the 5th, the Strypa was visible from the ridgeline ahead, a thin silver line in the grey landscape, perhaps 8 kilometers distant. Beyond it, if the radio messages that division had received were accurate, if the encoded transmissions that came through in fragments between bursts of static could be trusted, beyond it was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Hausa. Relief. 8 kilometers. In normal conditions, a march of 2 hours. In this mud, with these men under this fire, it might as well have been 800. We started walking. The last fight was at a crossroads 3 kilometers east of the Strypa. A Soviet anti-tank position had been set up overnight. 2 guns, a dozen infantry, a hastily dug trench line across the road. They had been placed there to stop exactly what was coming. They opened fire on the lead elements of our column at 600 meters. The first round hit a Panzer wagon and blew it apart. The horse went down in the traces. The wounded men on the wagon were thrown into the mud on both sides of the road. I did not give orders. There were no orders left to give that these men did not already know. Eltmann went left with his 7 remaining soldiers. Riedel went right with 5. I went straight with whoever was behind me. We ran at the guns across open ground because there was no other ground, because flanking would take an hour we did not have, because the column behind us was still moving and could not stop. The Soviet gunners were good. They fired 3 rounds in the time it took us to close the distance. 1 round passed between Riedel's group and mine, close enough that the blast knocked 2 men sideways. But they were firing at a dispersed line of men moving fast across broken terrain, and anti-tank guns are made for killing machines, not men spread across a muddy field. Eltmann reached the trench first. He dropped into it with a grenade already in his hand, and the explosion sent a column of dirt into the air. Riedel was into the gun pit seconds later. I arrived to find it finished. The Soviet infantry had broken and run west toward the river. The gun crews were dead at their posts. Eltmann was sitting in the trench. He was holding his side. When he moved his hand, there was blood, dark, steady, soaking through his tunic from a wound below the ribs. He told me it was nothing. He told me this while his face turned the color of the sky above us, which was the color of ash. Riedel cut the tunic open and packed the wound with a field dressing that was immediately saturated. We loaded Eltmann onto the next wagon that came through. He gripped my hand as they lifted him and said something I did not hear over the noise of the column. The Strypa crossing was a ford. The bridge had been destroyed. By whom, nobody knew. And the engineers had marked a crossing point where the water was waist deep and the bottom was gravel rather than mud. We waded across in a line, holding weapons above our heads, the current pulling at legs that had no strength left to resist it. The water was snowmelt. It burned with cold. A man from another unit lost his footing and went under, and 2 others grabbed him before the river took him. On the western bank, I climbed the slope on hands and knees. My legs would not carry me upright. Riedel pulled me the last 2 meters, and we lay on the grass at the top, gasping, staring at a sky that was beginning to clear for the first time in days. It was there, lying in the wet grass on the western bank of the Strypa, that I heard the engines from the west, coming from the west. I raised my head. Riedel was already on his feet, his rifle up, because engines meant tanks and tanks meant death. That was the equation we had lived by for weeks, but the shapes that appeared on the road from the direction of Buchach were not T-34s. They were half-tracks. German half-tracks, with markings I did not immediately recognize, moving in column with infantry riding on the hulls. A reconnaissance patrol. The lead vehicle stopped 50 meters from us, and a man in SS camouflage stood up in the commander's hatch. He looked at us, at our mud-caked uniforms, our hollow faces, our weapons held in hands that shook with cold and exhaustion, and he raised his hand. Not a salute. A wave. A simple wave, the gesture of one man acknowledging another across a distance that was not measured in meters. Riedel lowered his rifle. He sat down in the mud. He did not get up again for a long time. The date was the 6th of April. The lead elements of the 1st Panzer Division had made contact with the reconnaissance units of Hausser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps near Buchach. The link-up was confirmed by radio at 1100 hours. Behind us, the column was still crossing the Strypa. Behind the column, the rearguard was still fighting. Behind the rearguard, the dead lay in the mud of 4 river crossings and 100 unnamed villages across 150 kilometers of Ukrainian spring. I sat on the western bank and watched the column come in. They came as individuals and in small groups, on foot and on wagons, some carrying wounded, some carrying nothing, some barely able to carry themselves. They came with mud to their waists and blood on their uniforms, and the look of men who had walked out of a place that no one was supposed to leave. 45 armored vehicles, out of an army that had once fielded hundreds. The rest was men and horses, and silence. Nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. The men who came through sat down where they stopped and stared at the ground or at the sky or at nothing. Some slept where they fell, in the road, in the ditches, in the fields beside the road, sleep claiming them mid-step, mid-word, as if a wire had been cut. Riedel was beside me. He had produced a cigarette from somewhere, his last, or someone else's last. It did not matter. He broke it in half without being asked and handed me the longer piece. We smoked in silence while the column passed. The tobacco was stale. The paper was damp. It tasted like mud and gunpowder and cold river water. Behind us, to the east, the sound of guns continued.